Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The laugh I didn't expect. What if the moment that saved my marriage started with a joke I almost missed? I was sitting at my kitchen table in the United States, exhausted, staring at a cup of coffee that had clearly given up on me, while my English practice book sat open like it was judging my life choices. I was tired of trying, tired of pretending I was fine, and honestly, tired of saying, "I'm okay," when I was not. Then my daughter said one ridiculous sentence, my husband laughed, and somehow, I laughed too. I did not know it then, but that tiny laugh was the beginning of my healing. My life in America looked normal from the outside. We had a home, a marriage, children, busy mornings, school schedules, grocery trips, changing weather, and all the small routines that make family life feel wonderfully ordinary. But inside me, something had become very quiet. I was carrying stress from one day into the next, and even simple things felt harder than they should. Sometimes I opened an English lesson and understood every word, yet my mind still whispered, "Not today." That sentence became my enemy. Not today meant tomorrow, and tomorrow quietly became next week. Psychology gives us a simple reason this can happen. When we feel stressed for too long, our attention becomes narrower. Our brain starts looking for problems instead of possibilities. Learning can feel like another demand, even when we actually enjoy it. So I stopped trying to learn English perfectly. Instead, I began listening to the English around me, my children asking questions, my husband making jokes, neighbors talking about the weather, and ordinary conversations at the store. I repeated short sentences slowly. "It's cold today. I'm tired. Give me a minute." Simple English. Real English. No fancy textbook drama. And strangely, the more relaxed I became, the more I remembered. But the biggest change did not come from a lesson. It came one evening when my husband walked into the kitchen, looked at my serious face, and said something so unexpectedly funny that I laughed before I could stop myself. Then my daughter laughed. Then my son laughed. Within seconds, all four of us were laughing at something that was not even that funny. And for the first time in months, I noticed something important. My home did not need a perfect mother. My family needed me present. That night, after everyone went to bed, I found a small note beside my English book. I read it once, then twice. The handwriting was messy, the spelling was funny, but the meaning was painfully clear. And what it said made my heart stop. When love felt heavy. The note said, "Mom, please laugh more." 5 simple words, written in my daughter's uneven handwriting, somehow felt heavier than a long speech. I stood in the kitchen holding that little piece of paper, and suddenly I understood why the laughter from the night before had felt so different. I had been trying so hard to keep my family happy that I had forgotten to be happy with them. In our American home, life moved quickly. Mornings began with alarms, lunches, school bags, coffee, and someone always asking, "Where are my shoes?" Evenings were filled with homework, dinner, laundry, dishes, and conversations that often ended with, "We'll talk tomorrow." My husband and I loved each other, but love had started feeling like another responsibility on a long to-do list. We were not fighting dramatically. There were no movie-style arguments with doors slamming and plates flying. Our problem was quieter. We were becoming tired strangers who happened to share a kitchen. Sometimes my husband asked, "How was your day?" and I answered, "Fine." He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes." We both knew those answers were not completely true, but neither of us had enough energy to investigate. This is one reason emotional stress can become so difficult. When people are overloaded, communication often becomes shorter and less patient. The brain prefers quick answers because quick answers require less effort. In simple English, I started noticing a useful difference between "I'm fine" and "I'm having a hard day." The first sentence closed the door. The second opened it. So one evening, I decided to try something small. When my husband asked how I was, I did not say fine. I looked at him and said slowly, "I'm tired today. I need you to listen." He was quiet for a moment. Then he put down his phone. That tiny action meant more than a perfect romantic sentence. He listened. I talked about the pressure I had been carrying, the fear of disappointing everyone, and how embarrassed I sometimes felt when I forgot simple English words. I even admitted something that sounded silly. Sometimes I avoided speaking English because I was afraid of making mistakes in front of people. My husband smiled gently and said, "Then make mistakes with me." I laughed because his English was not exactly perfect either, especially when he was tired. For a few minutes, our kitchen became a safe place instead of a place where we simply completed chores. We talked about our children, our marriage, and the strange way adulthood can make people forget how to play. But just when I thought that conversation had solved something important, my husband looked toward the hallway and said, "There is something I haven't told you about what happened yesterday." I stopped smiling. His voice had changed. And suddenly, I knew our little family story was about to become much more complicated. Our house lost its laughter. My husband's words made the kitchen suddenly feel much quieter. "There is something I haven't told you about yesterday." I looked at him and waited. He did not immediately explain. Instead, he took a slow breath and said, "Our daughter asked me why you don't laugh anymore." I felt my stomach drop. I had expected him to tell me something about work, money, or one of the ordinary problems adults carry around like invisible backpacks. I never expected that my children had been watching me so closely. I looked toward the hallway and imagined my daughter listening to the adults she loved, trying to understand why the woman who used to laugh at silly things had become so serious. That moment hurt, but it also gave me a strange kind of clarity. I realized that I had not suddenly become unhappy. I had simply become used to carrying stress. In the United States, our family life was full of movement. There were school mornings, traffic, changing seasons, grocery stores, family appointments, weekend plans, and the endless little decisions that somehow multiply when you have children. None of these things was terrible. That was the strange part. My life was not falling apart. I was just tired of holding everything together. And when you are tired for long enough, even something you love can feel like work. English practice became one of those things. I would sit with a short story and read, I went to the store. Easy sentence. Very easy. But my brain would answer, why are you doing this? You have dishes. Then I would listen to an English conversation and miss one word. Suddenly, I believed I had failed. Looking back, I understand that stress changes the way we experience small mistakes. When our mind is overloaded, one tiny problem can feel like evidence that we are not good enough. That is why I changed my approach. Instead of asking myself, did I understand everything? I asked, what did I understand? That question was much kinder. I began listening to one short English sentence at a time. The weather is beautiful today. I repeated it slowly. The weather is beautiful today. Then I used it with my children. Soon, English was no longer a test. It became part of our home. One Saturday morning, my son looked outside and said, Mom, the weather is beautiful today. I smiled and answered, yes, it is. Then he added, completely seriously, but your coffee looks terrible. I burst out laughing. He looked confused for 1 second, then started laughing too. My husband walked into the room, saw all three of us laughing, and shook his head. What did I miss? He asked. I wanted to explain, but before I could, my daughter appeared holding something behind her back. She said, Mom, I found this in your old box. Then she handed it to me. I opened it, and what I saw inside brought back a memory I had almost forgotten. A small joke changed everything. Inside the old box was a photograph of our family from a few years earlier. We were standing outside on a sunny weekend in the United States, and everyone looked happy. But what caught my attention was my own face. I was laughing so hard that my eyes were almost closed. I stared at that picture for a long moment. My daughter asked, why were you laughing like that? I smiled and said, because your dad told the worst joke in America. My husband immediately protested. That was a great joke. I looked at him and laughed. You believe that? He smiled. I still do. The children started laughing because they had never heard the story. Suddenly, our quiet morning became noisy again. The strange thing was that nobody planned it. There was no special therapy session, no expensive trip, and no perfect motivational speech. It was simply a photograph, a bad joke, and a family willing to laugh together. That morning taught me something important about healing. Sometimes healing does not arrive dramatically. Sometimes it enters through the back door wearing pajamas and making terrible jokes. Researchers often connect positive social experiences, laughter, and emotional connection with reduced stress and stronger relationships. Laughter does not magically erase problems, but it can change the emotional atmosphere in which we face them. I could feel that difference in my own body. My shoulders relaxed. My breathing became slower. Even my thoughts felt less crowded. So I decided to make one small experiment. Every evening, instead of asking my family the usual question, did you finish your homework? I would ask something different. What made you laugh today? At first, the answers were ridiculous. My son said, my friend fell off a chair. My daughter said, Dad tried to dance. My husband said, your son thinks he can cook. I looked at my son. Can you cook? He nodded confidently. Absolutely. He had made toast once. We all laughed. But something deeper was happening. We were giving ourselves permission to notice good moments. I also changed the way I practiced English. Instead of studying for a long time, I chose one sentence from our evening conversation and repeated it. What made you laugh today? I said it slowly. Then again, naturally. What made you laugh today? It was simple, useful, and connected to real life. That mattered because meaningful learning is easier to remember when information has a personal connection. My English practice stopped feeling like homework. It became part of my family story. A few days later, my husband came home unusually quiet. He put his keys on the table and did not make his usual joke. I looked at him and asked, what happened? He hesitated. Then he said, I got some news today. I waited. His next sentence made me realize that our laughter had not solved everything. It had only given us enough strength to face what came next. Learning English without pressure. My husband sat quietly at the kitchen table, and for a moment, nobody spoke. I could see the worry in his face. He finally told me that something unexpected had happened at work, and our family might need to change some plans we had carefully made. I felt the familiar pressure rise inside me. My first thought was, what are we going to do? My second thought was, how can I help? And then I remembered something I had been learning. When everything feels uncertain, you do not have to solve the entire future tonight. Sometimes you only need to take the next small step. So I made coffee, sat beside him, and said, we will figure it out. I said the sentence slowly because I wanted him to hear the confidence, not just the words. We will figure it out. That became one of my favorite English sentences. It was simple, useful, and powerful. I started realizing that language learning could be connected to real emotions. Instead of memorizing long vocabulary lists, I practiced sentences I actually needed in my life. I need some time. Can you help me? I understand. I don't understand yet. Let's talk about it. These sentences were not impressive enough for a grammar textbook cover, but they were useful enough to change conversations. I also stopped punishing myself when I made mistakes. If I forgot a word, I described it another way. If my pronunciation sounded strange, I tried again. If I misunderstood someone, I asked, could you say that again, please? This was important because fear can make learning much harder. When you are afraid of being wrong, your attention often moves away from the meaning of the conversation and toward monitoring yourself. You start thinking, was my grammar correct? Did they notice my accent? Did I sound stupid? Suddenly, you are no longer listening. You are judging yourself. I had done that for years. Now I chose a different rule. Communication first, perfection later. My children helped me practice without even knowing it. At dinner, I would ask, what was the best part of your day? Then they had to answer in English. Sometimes their answers were funny. Sometimes they were completely unexpected. One evening my daughter said, "The best part was when Dad burned the pancakes." My husband looked offended. "They were not burned." My son immediately said, "They were black." Everyone laughed. I laughed so hard that I almost forgot the difficult news from earlier. That was when I understood something beautiful. English was not only a subject I was studying. It was becoming a bridge between my feelings and the people I loved. But just as our family began finding its rhythm again, my husband asked me a question I was not prepared to answer. "Are you happy with me?" Love needed more than words. I looked at my husband and realized that sometimes the hardest English sentence is not a complicated one. It is a simple question that reaches directly into your heart. "Are you happy with me?" he asked again. I wanted to give him an easy answer. I wanted to say, "Of course," smile, and move on. But I had learned that "I'm fine" could sometimes hide a whole room full of feelings. So I took a breath and said, "I love you, but I have not felt like myself lately." My husband did not defend himself. He did not interrupt. He simply listened. That silence was uncomfortable at first, but it was also strangely comforting. I told him that I had been measuring my happiness by how well I managed everything. If the children were okay, I felt okay. If the house was clean, I felt successful. If my English was good, I felt confident. If I made a mistake, I felt disappointed. Somewhere along the way, I had turned life into a test I could never finish. My husband finally said, "Maybe we don't need to be perfect. Maybe we just need to be honest." I smiled because that sounded simple, but simple does not mean easy. In relationships, people sometimes try to solve emotional problems with practical solutions. We ask, "What should we do?" before asking, "What are you feeling?" We give advice when the other person only needs someone to stay and listen. Psychology often emphasizes the importance of feeling heard and emotionally supported in close relationships. Being listened to does not automatically solve a problem, but it can reduce the feeling that you are carrying the problem alone. That night, my husband and I made a small agreement. When one of us said, "I need to talk," the other person would put the phone away and listen before trying to fix anything. It sounded almost too simple. But simple habits can become powerful when repeated. We also created a funny family rule. Nobody was allowed to say, "My English is terrible." Instead, we had to say, "My English is growing." The children loved this rule because they could catch us breaking it. One evening I forgot a word and said, "My English is terrible." My daughter immediately pointed at me and shouted, "Rule." Everyone laughed. I corrected myself. "My English is growing." She nodded proudly. Much better. I realized healing was beginning to look different from what I had imagined. It was not becoming a completely new person. It was becoming kinder to the person I already was. My marriage was not suddenly perfect. Our family still had stressful mornings, misunderstandings, unfinished chores, and moments when everyone wanted to scream into a pillow. But now we could talk about those moments. We could laugh after them. We could begin again. Then one Sunday afternoon, while we were driving through our neighborhood, my daughter suddenly asked a question about our family that made everyone in the car go silent. The American days I started noticing. My daughter looked out the car window and suddenly asked, Mom, why do grown-ups stop noticing things? Nobody answered immediately. My husband looked at me, and I looked at the road ahead. It was such a simple question, but somehow it felt like someone had opened a window inside my mind. I thought about our life in the United States and how quickly ordinary days could disappear. We drove past houses, trees, stores, schools, and people walking their dogs. The weather was changing, the sky was bright, and my children were talking in the back seat. But I realized I had spent so much time thinking about what needed to happen next that I had barely noticed what was happening now. I started paying attention to small American moments that I had previously considered ordinary. The friendly "how are you" at a store. The person holding a door open for someone behind them. Neighbors talking about the weather as if the weather were a full-time family member. Someone complaining about traffic and then laughing about it 30 seconds later. These moments became little lessons for me. They also became easy English practice. I would listen carefully when people said, "How's your day going?" or "It's a beautiful morning." Instead of translating every word in my head, I focused on the meaning and the situation. This made listening feel more natural. I learned that real English is often shorter and messier than textbook English. People interrupt themselves. They use contractions. They change sentences halfway through. They laugh. They forget words. They say, "You know what I mean," when they clearly do not know what they mean. That made me feel better about my own mistakes. If native speakers could change direction in the middle of a sentence, perhaps I did not need to speak like a grammar robot either. My family began turning ordinary moments into small adventures. We went for walks, watched the seasons change, cooked together, and talked about funny things we saw during the day. Sometimes we practiced one English phrase together. Sometimes we simply enjoyed being quiet. I began noticing that healing was connected to attention. When I paid attention to my children, I noticed their personalities changing. When I paid attention to my husband, I noticed how often he tried to make me smile. When I paid attention to myself, I noticed that I was not as broken as I had believed. I was simply tired. And tired people do not always need a new life. Sometimes they need rest, connection, and permission to enjoy the life they already have. One evening, while we were sitting outside our home, my son asked me to tell him the story of the first time his father made me laugh. I started telling it, but halfway through, my husband interrupted with a completely different version. We both insisted that our version was correct. The children started laughing. Then my daughter asked the question that stopped all of us again, "Mom, were you happier before you became a mom?" My children became my teachers. I looked at my daughter and smiled, but her question stayed with me. Were you happier before you became a mom? It was the kind of question children ask without realizing they have just opened a very serious door. I told her the truth. I was happy in different ways. But becoming a mother taught me a kind of happiness I did not know before. She nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. Then my son said, "So you were happier because we are funny?" I laughed. "Sometimes. And sometimes you are the reason I need a vacation." He laughed so loudly that my husband nearly dropped his drink. That evening reminded me that children do not need perfect parents. They need parents who are emotionally present, willing to listen, and willing to admit when they are wrong. I had spent so much time trying to teach my children that I had forgotten how much they were teaching me. They taught me that mistakes are normal. When my son pronounced an English word incorrectly, he did not become embarrassed. He simply tried again. When my daughter forgot a sentence, she made up a new one. They were not waiting for perfection before participating in life. I realized adults often do the opposite. We wait until our English is better before speaking. We wait until our confidence returns before trying something new. We wait until life becomes easier before allowing ourselves to enjoy it. My children seemed to have no interest in that strategy. They just lived. So I borrowed their approach. One afternoon, I practiced English while cooking. I said simple sentences aloud. "I am cutting vegetables. The soup is hot. Dinner is almost ready." My daughter walked into the kitchen and stared at me. "Mom, are you talking to yourself?" I said, "I am practicing English." She thought for a second and answered, "Okay. But the soup is burning." I looked at the pot. She was right. My English practice had become so exciting that I had nearly destroyed dinner. We laughed, and I turned off the stove. That little moment taught me something practical. Learning works better when it is connected to real life. But real life still requires you to watch the soup. I began using everyday activities to practice listening and speaking instead of creating long study sessions that made me feel overwhelmed. 5 minutes while cooking. A few sentences during a walk. One short story before bed. Small practice became sustainable practice. More importantly, I stopped using English as a measurement of my worth. My mistakes did not mean I was failing. They meant I was participating. Slowly, my confidence returned. My husband noticed it first. One evening he said, "You seem different." I smiled. "Different how?" He answered, "You laugh before you worry now." That sentence stayed in my mind. I had not realized it, but something inside me had changed. Yet the next morning, an unexpected phone call brought back an old fear I thought I had finally defeated. The person on the other end spoke quickly, used unfamiliar English, and asked me a question I was not ready for. Healing became our new habit. The phone call came early in the morning, just as I was preparing breakfast. A woman from a local organization was calling about something important for our family, and she spoke faster than I expected. For a few seconds, I understood almost nothing. My old fear returned immediately. My heart started beating faster, and that familiar voice inside my head whispered, "You are going to make a mistake." But this time, I did something different. I took a breath and said, "I'm sorry. Could you speak more slowly, please?" The woman repeated herself. I understood more. Then I asked another question. Could you explain that one more time? She did. Slowly, the conversation became clear. When the call ended, I stood in the kitchen and smiled. Nothing dramatic had happened. I had simply asked someone to slow down. But for me, it felt like a victory. I realized that confidence does not always mean feeling fearless. Sometimes confidence means being afraid and continuing anyway. That morning, I told my husband what happened. He smiled and said, "See? Your English is growing." I laughed. "You sound like our daughter." He answered, "She is smarter than both of us." We both laughed again. By then, laughter had become part of our family routine. We did not laugh because our problems had disappeared. We laughed because we had learned that problems did not deserve every minute of our attention. Our family created small habits that helped us stay connected. At dinner, we asked one simple question: "What made you smile today?" Before bed, I practiced one short English sentence with the children. On weekends, my husband and I took a walk together without our phones. Sometimes we talked about serious things. Sometimes we argued about absolutely nothing. Once, we spent 10 minutes debating whether a squirrel looked angry. My husband said yes. I said the squirrel simply had a busy morning. Neither of us won. Somehow, that was the point. Healing had become ordinary. It was not a dramatic transformation. It was a collection of small choices repeated until they started changing the atmosphere of our home. Psychology often describes habits as behaviors that become easier when repeated in stable situations. That idea helped me understand why our little routines mattered. We were not waiting to feel happy before acting differently. We were creating small opportunities for connection, and those opportunities gradually changed how we felt. My English improved too, but not because I suddenly became brilliant. I became consistent. I listened more. I spoke more. I accepted mistakes faster. Most importantly, I stopped being ashamed of them. One evening, my husband and I sat together after the children went to bed. He reached for my hand and said, "Do you remember when you thought our family was losing its laughter?" I nodded. Then he smiled and said, "I think we found something better." I asked, "What?" He looked at me and answered, "A reason to laugh even when life is hard." I thought that was the end of the story. I was wrong. The next morning, my daughter placed another note beside my English book. Laughter taught me to stay. The note said, "Mom, I like you better when you laugh." I read it twice, then laughed so hard that my eyes filled with tears. My daughter walked into the kitchen and asked, "Why are you crying?" I held up the note and said, "Because you made me happy and embarrassed me at the same time." She smiled and hugged me. In that moment, I understood the real lesson of everything we had been through. Healing did not mean becoming the woman I used to be. It meant becoming a woman who could feel tired, make mistakes, face difficult days, and still find a reason to stay present. Life in the United States was still busy. Our family still had responsibilities. My children still argued about ridiculous things. My husband still told jokes that were sometimes so bad they should probably require a warning label. And I still made English mistakes. But none of those things frightened me the way they once had. I had learned to slow down. I had learned to say, "Please repeat that." I had learned to say, "I need help." I had learned to say, "I don't know." And perhaps the most important sentence was, "It's okay to try again." Those simple English sentences became more than language practice. They became reminders of how I wanted to live. If you are learning English and sometimes feel frustrated, remember this: you do not need to understand every word to understand the story. You do not need perfect grammar to communicate. You do not need perfect pronunciation to be heard. Start with one sentence. Listen to it. Read it slowly. Say it aloud. Use it in your real life. Then repeat tomorrow. That is how confidence grows, not through one giant breakthrough, but through hundreds of tiny moments when you choose not to quit. I also learned something about love. A strong marriage is not a life without problems. It is a relationship where two people can face problems without becoming enemies. Sometimes my husband needed me to listen. Sometimes I needed him to listen. Sometimes our children needed both of us to stop being serious adults for 5 minutes and laugh at something completely stupid. And somehow, those ordinary moments became precious. Looking back, I once believed healing would arrive when everything became easier. Now I know better. Healing came while life was still messy. It came through a bad joke, a child's handwritten note, a difficult conversation, a nervous English phone call, a family dinner. And one simple decision to laugh again. So if you are watching this while feeling tired, discouraged, or ready to give up on your English journey, stay with yourself a little longer. Your progress may be quieter than you expect. Your next sentence may feel small. Your next laugh may seem meaningless. But sometimes a small sentence changes a conversation, a small laugh changes a home, and one small moment of courage changes a life. For me, US laughter taught me healing. And healing mattered because it taught me something I will never forget. Sometimes the life you think is falling apart is simply asking you to slow down, breathe, listen, and begin again.